Welcome to Fasken's 13th consecutive mining series for the PDAC. My name is Michael Barassa. I'm with the Global Mining Group at Fasken here in the Toronto office. Today's session, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, how has it affected international mineral markets and national security implications for Canada? This is the fifth in the series that we're doing of 9 sessions throughout the PDAC. We've got 90 people that registered today to attend in person and 163 who registered online, so we have a really good attendance. For the online attendees, please see the information slide that is posted on the screen right now. We are pleased to welcome a very international panel for today's event. This session was done at the International Bar Association conference in Miami last November. It was really well attended. We have the same panel. We've also added Andrew House from from Fasken to the panel as well. So the panel, first, our 2 moderators. We have Nora Pincus on the far side. She's the managing partner in Nebari Partners, based in Miami, but she lives in Bozeman, Montana. Nora is also a board member of the Foundation for Natural Resources and Energy Law. Those of you would know that is formerly the Rocky Mountain Mineral Law Foundation. Casper Herler, right next to me, is the managing partner at Borenius law firm in Helsinki, and he's the former co-chair of the IBA's Mining Law Committee. And next, our panel. So Andrew House on the far side, he's the co-leader of the National Security Practice Group here at Fasken. He's based in our Ottawa office. He was chief of staff to successive ministers of public safety and emergency preparedness before joining Fasken's. John Price, closest to me, is the managing director of America's Mineral Market Intelligence. John is based in Miami. He spends part of his time in Berlin with his family, and because of that he has knowledge of mining and issues in the Americas, and that's been expanded to Eastern Europe as well. And last, but definitely not least, is Daniel Bilak. He's a partner at Kinstellar in Kyiv. Traveled all the way here from Kyiv to be here today with us. He was the head of Ukraine Invest and currently serves in the Territorial Defense Forces of Ukraine, which you can tell by his shirt today. He started his legal career here at Fasken's, actually, in the 1990s, so we welcome him back. So over to you, Nora and Casper. Casper, I think, is going to start with a 10-minute slide presentation to sort of set the background, the context for what's to be discussed today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I think, first of all, I just wanted to share you the sort of background idea why this panel on the impact on the minerals market of the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion. And that had to do with an idea on that there was no lack of discussion on the energy crisis and the impact on hydrocarbons, both oil and gas, during the first half year after the invasion started. But it kind of created, for a mining lawyer and one who kind of advises the mining industry, a question on what about minerals? What about the minerals? There's a lot of wealth and Russia is a significant mining country. How does this sort of war impact the flow of minerals? And that kind of and there hasn't been a significant response to that. And with a couple of slides, I'm just going to give you a status update on where we are in terms of the framework and the responses on the minerals side, and then Nora will start posing very good questions to our panelists. So basically, with respect to the sanction regimes, or if we kind of first look at what's the dependency of the world and the mineral market on Russia? We can see aluminium. There's clearly Russia is a significant aluminium producer, an important nickel producer, and the Kola Peninsula, the Norilsk deposits and others, and then especially on the palladium side, we can see that there's a very critical production of that, and then potash and vanadium. There we have critical strategic dependencies. If we then look at the current sanctions regimes at the moment impacting the the Russian mining industry, and generally sort of Western sanctions are targeting Russian key economic sectors. And so one of the most important responses towards the mining economy and the mining business in Russia is related to export of Western technologies to kind of keep up the mining and also improve mining in Russia. That there's sanctions on that point, and then sort of more generally limiting market access of Russian goods to Western markets. And then there's a number of import restrictions to Russian oil, coal, iron, gold, and other commodities such as steel. But what's kind of more interesting from this panel's point of view, what's kind of outside the sanctions. So imports of industrial base metals and of Russian origin, such as aluminium and nickel and palladium and titanium, are kind of significant mineral flows that are not impacted by sanctions. And if you look at EU sanctions, where you see minerals more than on the sanction side, you see minerals on the exempted sides of. So in many EU sanction lists, when you look at the exemptions, you see various sort of mineral streams being made sure that they are exempt. So I think even on the legal side, because we now have sanctions on providing legal advice in the EU towards Russian entities, there is an exemption for minerals. So certain kind of minerals-related exemptions for providing legal advice. So that paints the picture that there's somebody in the decision making that thinks that the continued supply of Russian minerals is somehow something that needs to be safeguarded in some respect. The current sanctions sort of impacting Russian minerals industry. So a conclusion of this is that the direct impact is relatively low, but U.S. has sort of ramped up certain measures. There's a new increase in tariff schemes by the Biden administration very recently on the 24th of February. And then there's a communication that to make sure that there's still and continuously a capability of kind of putting more targeted efforts, or for instance, particular oligarchs or similar, which is an efficient way of sanctioning not the minerals, but actually somebody who is running a very significant resource operation. And we've seen some kind of oligarchs and businesses being targeted by sanctions. So likely the impacts of sanctions are more kind of in the medium and long term at the moment rather than immediate impacts. And then there are financial restrictions as well, but that doesn't have such a big impact because there's not that much Western ownership in the Russian resource industry, and that has long-term sort of background relating to the strategic resources legislation in Russia, which has basically led to that it has not been meaningful for Western companies to hold title into Russian minerals supply, and most of such ownership has also kind of been expropriated by Russian ownership. So an interesting feature, and we will talk more about this in the panel, is that there has clearly been a trend and a driver to look at what are the market impacts of any sanctions or restrictions on the flow of Russian minerals into the world mineral market, and that seems to be a concern both in the EU and the US, and we've seen this before. So in 2018, US authorities put certain sort of restrictions on Rusal, and that had pretty dramatic impacts on aluminium prices. So there is a history where which has kind of created a cautiousness in this respect. When we had this panel earlier on, the London Metals Exchange had in October, November started a consultation on towards the market actors on kind of how they see any measures from the London Metals Exchange point of view on sort of restricting trade of Russian minerals on the LME, and the conclusion of that was that there is kind of certain fears on doing any drastic measures with respect to the trading platform on excluding Russian minerals, so basically some sort of a status quo seems to be the prevailing approach from LME. But we'll get back to this during the panel, but this as a background. So over to Nora.
Thanks, Casper. So I think, one question that we probably all have sitting here is we want to hear from Daniel what things are like on the ground, and acknowledge that he's come a long way to be with us today, and we're thinking of him as he makes that journey.
Thanks very much, Nora. It is a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Michael, for all your efforts in organizing this. And my partners in Kinstellar let me out of the country to be here, which I'm grateful for. And it's kind of like a homecoming. I started my career at Fasken's, and it's great to be here. I have to say that, being back here and being with all of you and seeing Toronto and the normalcy of everyday life, I always find that a bit of a jarring experience. Even though I do it frequently, but you never really get easy transition. We've had for the last 3 weeks a steady supply of electricity and a steady supply of heat, something most of you don't have to worry about. We were on rolling blackouts for a period of almost 3 months, except they weren't very rolling because we were being bombed every week. And so we were in extreme blackouts, which meant that for a number of days at a time, we wouldn't have electricity. I'm lucky I have a generator at my house, so all I do is have to pay for the diesel to keep it running. But people who live in the downtown and in apartment buildings, not just in Kyiv but across the country, are faced with far more compelling vulnerabilities. And I think that one of the great lessons of this war is that Ukrainian people are resistant, they're resilient, and they're resolute. No matter what Putin throws at us, we will take it and we will fight back even more. And there are a lot of things to unpack during this discussion, and it's great to have it again with all of you, because we did this in Miami in November when we were just starting to be bombed with rockets and drones, and a lot of people have lost their lives since then. But there is this resilience, and this resistance means that we're not going to give up, no matter what happens. And I think that's an important message to give to the West, is that people who want us to negotiate because of fear of escalation and all this kind of stuff, there's a lot of moral hazard attached to that. I'll develop that a little more in our discussion. But 89% of Ukrainians have said that they will fight to their last breath, even if Putin uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So he's going to have to kill all of us in order to take the country. And I think that at the same time, we are moving towards victory. We believe that we can win this year. but we need the weapons in order to do it. We're not getting them in the quantities and in the time that they've been promised, and that's a real problem. We have a huge problem in Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine, where we're losing a lot of our best men, but we're just being swamped by waves and waves and waves of Russian military. Most of them were prisoners, rapists, murderers, pedophiles, cannibals, and so they're losing the dregs of their society while we're losing, our heroes. And it's a huge cost, but we've held off. I think we're pulling back right now. A little bit. It's more of it's a strategic move. It's certainly not a defeat, but it's meant that we've been able to degrade their military even further. In fact, it's an important point that we have degraded the Russian military, the entire Russian military, by 50% since the beginning of this war, the second army of the world. 97% of the Russian army is in Ukraine. And so, what we need the West to understand is that this is our common victory. This is something that is not a war in Ukraine. This is something that is at the very least, an issue of European or Euro-Atlantic security. But as China is now doubling down on assisting Russia, including perhaps with weapons, this becomes a global war. This becomes something that is infinitely more uncertain and unpredictable. And, you sort of wonder, well, okay, what do minerals have to do with all of this? In fact, minerals have everything to do with this. As Casper pointed out in his presentation, most of the focus to this point in time has been on energy, oil, gas, because that's what heats your homes and you pay the bills on. But the things that drive your iPhones and your watches and all the things that you don't really see or pay for directly get swept under the carpet. But when you see that rare earth metals and key mineral supplies are not subject to sanction, that's a problem for me. It's a problem because the whole point of a sanctions policy is not to punish Russia, to give them a slap on the wrist. They got that after Crimea, and the result was 8 years later we have a full-scale invasion. The only way you deal with the Russians is to defeat them, totally. So they understand they've been defeated. And if you're pouring billions of dollars into the Russian treasury every month, paying for the metals that they're exporting around the world, I'm sorry, those are blood minerals. That money that goes into their coffers are being used to kill Ukrainians every single day. My friends, I've lost family members, and everybody in the country has. There isn't a single family in Ukraine that has not been affected in some way by a loss or a wounded friend or family member. And so I think the context of today's discussion is multi-layered, actually. There's in business, we don't like to focus on the moral issues because they get in the way of transactions. But what I would like to say is that I think that this war has shown that there are huge costs to doing business with dictators, tyrants, and terrorists. It's not just about business. Sooner or later, you have to pay the piper, and somebody pays the cost. And the moral hazard in all of this is we're paying the cost. The EU especially has been Putin's great enabler in terms of energy and policy over the past few years. And we're paying for that now. You're paying a little bit, EU is paying a little bit higher in energy prices. The cost of a latte has probably gone up 30%. But, we're paying with our lives, and we're paying with our lives to defend Western democracy. And so I think that this discussion today is very important in many, many different ways. And looking forward to having it roll it out. Thanks very much.
Well, we've talked a little bit about what the West is not doing in terms of sanctions, but sort of stepping back a bit, I'm interested in your views on what has changed in the mineral space and what we are feeling as a result of Russia's invasion.
Sure. Let me just acknowledge that 90% of you have a look on your face that I had the first time I heard this man speak, of just awe. And 10% of you are thinking, what do the two guys on either side of him have to say, and what could they possibly say? So let me just start by saying that, and Daniel's too humble, I think, to have mentioned this, but one of the reasons he's as impassioned as he has is that 30 years ago he moved to the Ukraine, and his work and the work of his wife, who's a Supreme Court justice, was building the very building blocks of institutions in the Ukraine that have turned it from a country, a questionable democracy with a lot of oversized influence by Moscow, into an independent country that has resisted that and that has really pursued more and more policy-wise the will of its people. And that only happens when people like Daniel build that democracy institution at a time. And I mention that not only to acknowledge all the work that he's done, but to say that what's going on in the Ukraine is impactful around the world. I work, and I spent the last 30 years working in Latin America. I also married to a German, so I spent a lot of time in Europe. And I've seen up close this slippage in democracy, the undermining of institutions in places like Mexico, years ago in places like Venezuela, over this administration and the previous administration in Brazil, in Hungary. And this war, I think, has garnered the kind of response, emotional and political and military response from the West, because they recognize that what the West was built upon is under threat in many places. And so I think the world has to win this war because it's more than just a war between the Ukraine and Russia. It's a war between liberal Western democracy and some sort of autocratic alternative that we have been too willing to accommodate over the last several years. Now, Daniel raised a point, and we had a discussion before this meeting as to why is it that the world responded as quickly and effectively as it has with its energy sanctions, but not so with mineral sanctions. Well, if you look at a map around the world, you'll see that roughly 40% or 50% of the world's landmass is made up of countries that are net energy exporters. In other words, if you cut one of them off, there's plenty to fill the space, okay? In some of the minerals that Russia produces, copper and nickel in particular, you could also make the case. There's enough alternative supply around the world that companies could take it upon themselves as a gesture of social responsibility to stop buying supplies from Russia. But in some of those minerals where Russia commands a significant percentage of global supply, there's only a small handful of competitor suppliers. Meanwhile, there's a world out there of manufacturers that depend upon it. And that's why we have not seen neither the corporate resolve nor the political resolve to get behind sanctions in some of these minerals. And to Daniel's point, until we do, we are continuing to facilitate the enriching of Russia and therefore its ability to keep financing this war. And even if we're not selling them weapons, there's a massive black market world out there of weaponry that can be bought with dollars. And so I think that is an area that will be a future battleground of corporate responsibility and educating our corporations around the world, and the role of lawyers in doing so, I think, is crucial. But that is, I think, the next battleground when it comes to compliance and sanctions. But we're not there yet. And the economic imperative's not there, so we have to find another way to do it.
And I think that really leads into the question about what is Canada's role here? I mean, both from a moral standpoint and, looking at sort of the stability of the economy from the minerals, the importance of minerals.
So fortunately for Canada, Canada is obviously a premier mining nation. We're blessed not only with a lot of mining know-how, but an incredible number of natural resources in the mining space. And when you look at Canada-Russia trade, it was minuscule to begin with. And then it dropped by 98% across the year 2022. And so fortunately, because Dan, I take entirely to heart the argument that you're making, I think it's well met, that simply because a mineral is critical doesn't mean that there is not a moral choice being made. Fortunately for Canada, that was an easier choice. We just don't have that kind of dependency on Russian minerals. Oil was a different question, but oil was dealt with effectively in sanctions. So the Canada sanctions regime actually is something that I think has been a source of surprise for some in Canada and a source of pride, in the sense that we got on this early, we got on it vigorously, and new names are added to that list constantly and consistently. And that is in large part, and I want to give credit to her, to our Deputy Prime Minister and our Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland. She has a very special angle and experience on this, her lived experience with Russia and the government of Russia. Goes back, I think, to her university days, where she was the target of the FSB's predecessor. That's pretty raw, and you've seen her take a leadership role, and therefore Canada has taken a leadership role. What Canada has been unable to do is really deal adequately in military aid, although we have now finally gotten to that as well with the provision of Leopard tanks. Thankfully, not a lot, but Canada, I think, is
First ones.
we got there first with the tanks, and proudly so. But I think Canada is now, as we move forward, facing a significant challenge at a strategic level because of the fact, frankly, and this is off topic, but I'm going to say it, we do public procurement very badly in this country. We don't have things to give to Ukraine because we don't have those things ourselves. And this is, I hope, going to be a generational wake-up call. It is, I think, for me, interesting to see how the world has responded in a sanctioned sense, with perhaps the exception of critical minerals. And we had a pretty vibrant discussion about this as we prepared for this session. They're called critical for a reason, and I think you can read that in two ways. One is that it's critical to your economy, and therefore if you don't impose sanctions, you are simply enriching yourself at the expense of Ukrainians, and that is wrong. The other sense in which you can see this is that they are critical technologically, militarily, and in an industrial sense, such that if you are to be a good friend and ally to Ukraine at this time of need, you have to keep up your own strength as well. And I think those two options are really up for debate, and I think we should have that discussion and that debate. I don't know which side of that I come down on right now. A lot of analysis required, and I'm fascinated, obviously, by what fellow panelists have to say in that regard.
Well, I'll help you out. If I can jump in, poor Casper and Nora. I mean, the moderators, they have the job from hell with this group. But I just wanted to respond, because both John and Andrew raised some really good points. It's not just a moral argument from my standpoint. It should be part of self-interest on the part of both miners as well as suppliers and people who are in the mineral space. You need to understand, and I think everybody does, that, especially given the capital investment. Now, there's no equity investment in Russia right now, but if you're buying, is this going to be a primary source of your supply? Is this part of your supply chain going forward, and how does that affect what you're going to be producing? If that's the case, you better have really good insurance or have a fantastic plan B, because these minerals may not be sanctioned today, but there is a very, very high possibility, given the fact that Putin is doubling down and the Chinese are doubling down on Putin, seem to be, that something else is going to happen. So this is not a static process. This is a dynamic process. And one of the things, and I think it's a key challenge for the sector, and actually perhaps a salutary one, is to keep innovating, to find alternate sources. Instead of palladium, can you use something else? What else drives iPhones? Maybe like with crystals, you can manufacture them in a lab and then build a manufacturing capability at scale in order to produce these things. So it's not a short-term situation. But the point was that this should be part of understanding that this is not the end. That these sanctions are something that are going to continue to go. That you've got to find alternative supply lines. You've got supply chains. You've got to find different dynamics. And it's not just about Russia. It's also now about China. And what John was talking about, this affects the collective West. That includes Australia, New Zealand, Japan, everybody who shares democratic principles. And this polarization that we saw, this decoupling from globalization that was starting before the war, is only going to be accelerated. I've found, war is a great accelerator of trends. Some good, some bad. But this one, where you're going to perhaps see more regionalization of supply chains in the mineral market, may end up driving innovation to find alternate sources and this way. I mean, Ukraine today is at the epicenter of global change. As I said before, this is not a Ukraine conflict. This is a global issue that you have to think about in global terms and not just in the short term, not just to when the war is over, because you're not going to go back to business as usual.
That's the way I think, kind of reading Russian policies and approaches, the way they frame the war, that it's a war against the West and not only Ukraine, and sort of just building on what you said, at least from a EU point of view, there's already 10 different sanctions packages being produced, and there seems to be a continued trend. So that makes politicians look for new ways of finding a way of kind of increasing the pressure and the financial impacts on Russia. So it would not be a surprise if kind of also minerals would soon be there in some shape or form. One thing which I wanted to get back to, which was a bit introduced by John here earlier, regarding the foundations of the Ukrainian kind of democracy and rule of law development. What's your view on sort of the transparency and corruption situation in Ukraine? I think that's probably from a Western point of view a quite critical one, and also a big risk for the Ukrainian government if they are not sort of watching that closely with respect to all the Western support that is flowing into Ukraine, and also probably a huge opportunity for the country for the future.
Yeah, thanks. I'm on now. Yeah. Thanks for the question, Casper. I think it's a really good one. Look, for 3 years, from 2016 to 2019, I was in the Ukrainian government. I was chief investment advisor to the Prime Minister Groisman, and I headed up an agency called Ukraine Invest, which was the Ukrainian government's foreign investment promotion agency. It was a pretty tough job because most investors at that point couldn't find Ukraine on a map of Ukraine. That has changed dramatically in the last year. But also, it was, the whole corruption narrative was one that was actively promoted by the Russians. In fact, it was even more so. This is exemplary, manifested the fact that Ukraine was a failed state. Corruption, that gets picked up by the press, and you get into a echo chamber where everybody is just putting your rampant, the adjectives, rampant, endemic, and all these kinds of things. What we didn't get credit for was the fact that from the end of the Maidan revolution, the revolution of dignity in 2014, to 2022, Ukraine did more than any other country in the world to set in place the institutional framework, the architecture for fighting corruption. We had set up a National Anti-Corruption Bureau, a Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, a Special Anti-Corruption Court. We brought in lots of transparency. All the public procurement. We even won get this, a global public procurement award. I didn't know you could get one of these things, but we got one for the system system that we put into place. And we had Western European countries interested in how it operated because it was very, very transparent. All our public finances were made public. And it shows that fighting corruption is actually a very easy thing. You shine light in dark corners. And that's what we tried to do. But for lots of reasons, it was always, yeah, but you haven't done this. Yeah, but, and you haven't done this. And I may be cynical, but our EU colleagues were really doing this in spades. And it was a way, I began to feel very strongly, that it was a way to keep Ukraine where it is while they could continue to do business with Russia. Because if you say to Ukraine, well, you're doing okay, but you haven't done enough, it means you don't have to advance the EU integration and membership agenda. You can just sort of have it parked there until you decide whether they're doing enough or not. Although, frankly, I think we achieved EU levels of corruption still, before the Maidan Revolution. So we should have been a member. But what we weren't doing, where they had a point, in which they constantly reminded us about, was that there weren't enough arrests. There weren't enough arrests, prosecutions, and sentencing of public officials for bad behavior. And in the old days, a lot of these things just got swept under the carpet, or people in powerful places hid, covered the people that got caught, et cetera, in these schemes. That has now changed. And we've seen that. The announcements that you've seen in the last few weeks show that the government and the institutions that were set up to prosecute, to investigate, prosecute, and sentence for corrupt behavior are actually functioning. And they are forcing government officials to really look hard at what's going on inside their ministries.
So if we continue from here, I think, still continuing in the Ukraine perspective. So if we first cover shortly Ukraine, and then we start talking about the Russian minerals, and then we perhaps take a look and some thoughts on sort of how does China play, and what does the same thing mean for the developments regarding China and dependency on China. So if I understood correctly, sort of Ukraine is not a significant mining country, and even though it has a lot of kind of mineral potential. So could you just cover where we are with that, and what type of future potential does that sort of create for Ukraine?
This actually comes back to the point I made earlier about looking for new sources and of supply in terms of your supply chain, and also as an aspect of Ukraine's Euro integration prospects. Now that we are a candidate country, something I never expected to see in my lifetime, didn't expect to see a war in my lifetime either. But this issue is very important. Ukraine is not, except for iron ore, is not a major, seen as a major mining country, precisely because, as part of the Soviet Union, they didn't want to be mining anywhere close to the western borders. It was much safer to, and at scale, you can destroy a lot more land and environment beyond Siberia, digging all this stuff up and sending it around the world. So there was never the investment in Soviet times in Ukraine, except in iron ore, to develop these areas. I was working on a privatization of a titanium conglomerate just before the war started. Ukraine has 20% of the world's ilmenite. I mean, the essential ingredient into making titanium. That is as strategic a metal as anybody can, and that's something easy for the public to understand. Titanium is obviously very, very important metal. And unfortunately, we get most of it from Russia and China today. And so if you're going to look for alternative sources of supply, this would be an ideal place. That mining combinat, the mining conglomerate, is going to be put back up for privatization, as will a number of the others. We have gold reserves in Zakarpattia on our western border that can be exploited, and there's other minerals as well. So I think that, and it's a big country; it's the size of France. So there is scale to be had there. That's just one example. So Ukraine it's not just about, what do you do to rebuild Ukraine in terms of its energy infrastructure and social infrastructure, et cetera. It's also about looking at new ways of exploiting the natural resources, something that the government is absolutely interested in doing.
I think that brings up kind of a good point about, tying back to your comments about foreign investment into Ukraine and concerns about the jurisdiction, the concerns about corruption potentially, and what both the rest of the Western world and the Ukraine can do once victory is secured to incentivize foreign investment, whether it be into the mineral sectors or other sectors. What does that look like on a go-forward basis?
Yeah, and this is highly topical. It's already been the topic of at least three major international fora and conferences, and there'll be more as they're developing. I mean, obviously, we're an agricultural powerhouse. The fact that Putin blocked our ports and the export of grains showed that people woke up to the fact that Ukraine feeds 400 million people around the world. Energy, obviously, we're not going to rebuild for lots of good reasons. We're not going to be rebuilding large district heating plants and oblast level heating plants. We're going to be doing something much more smaller, regional, local. That's going to have to be completely redone. All of this will actually be part of our EU accession process. It will be a driver of reform and reconstruction, which is right. I mean, I think the Ukrainians would like a blank check. Give us, $1 trillion and we'll rebuild the country. That's not going to happen, and that's just simply not realistic. In terms of foreign investment, Nora, normally, I mean, frankly, having been in that role for 3 years, we actually have had a very good foreign investment regime. We just couldn't keep up or compete with, the ultimate corruption, which is called state aid in the EU. Here on the one hand, the EU is trying to help us facilitate our integration and joining the EU. On the other hand, they're doling out cash to Korean and Japanese and other companies to take, we'll cover 3 years of your CapEx, we'll pay you we'll subsidize you 1,000 euros per worker. And the IMF is telling us, well, you got to collect every cent of your tax take. You can't even have tax incentives. I had to fight like a tiger to try to get us to allow us to build industrial parks and technology parks because we don't want tax incentives. So I think that these things are all back on the table, and I think I think investors will be very happy with what they're going to be able to find. Plus the backstop of sovereigns like the U.S. and super sovereigns like the EU. The French have already said, French companies, we got your back. If you invest in Ukraine, we will take country risk and military risk, key point, off the table. We will cover that. That gives you an equal playing field, which is all we ever asked for, a level playing field to compete with other companies. And I know the U.S. through DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, the old OPIC, are looking at something similar.
Yeah, I think, Daniel correctly predicts that companies, especially if they enjoy the blanket of protection, will rush into the Ukraine to invest there. But Ukraine. But we're here at PDAC, and when you walk the halls of PDAC and you talk to mining investors and you ask them, has their thinking changed over the last year in terms of, miners are some of the most risk-tolerant investors in the world, and they invest in all kinds of countries with all kinds of governments. And one of the dirty secrets in Latin America is that countries that are ruled by sort of dictators like Nicaragua can be great places to invest as a miner. Why? Because the greatest risk today in Latin America to mining investment is community opposition, is a very large and fragmented series of opponents to mining projects, in part because no central or very few central governments in Latin America can impose their will on local communities the way they could 15 years ago. Whereas places like Nicaragua, if you want to mine in Nicaragua, you sit down with Daniel Ortega and his cronies and you strike a deal, and he will guarantee that no community will oppose your mine and no union will stop working, and the roads will arrive to your mine, et cetera, et cetera. This war changes that, because this war is a message to miners that you shouldn't be doing business with dictators because of the reputational risk that comes with it. Yes, there will still be junior miners who are willing to take on that risk. But the larger mining companies are now suddenly much more, their risk used to be always on national politics, and it drifted towards local multiple actors and managing that risk. And now it's come back to also include, what is the reputation of the government with whom I'm doing business? And can I stand in a photo op with my arm around the president or the minister of mining of that country and sleep at night, and my investors will sleep at night? And I think that has changed. And I think that there are several mining jurisdictions around the world that are now question marks, not just because of proximity to conflict, but because of reputation of the leadership of those countries. And I think that's something that we're all very much more aware of, thanks to what's happened in the Ukraine.
I think that was an important point. And that's one of the aspects which we covered here, kind of the moral and the ethical and the reputational part, and then the other one in connection with Russia. And if we go over to the impact on Russian minerals, the economical impact, and basically the support that current trade gives to the government, because there is very little sort of private ownership of minerals, because minerals are strategic and minerals are in the control of the central government. So meaning that all kind of all money that flows into minerals will basically support the current policies and the current regime. What's been pretty interesting and sophisticated is the tools that were created by the West with respect to crude oil trade. Not sort of putting a ban or a sanction on crude oil imports of Russian crude oil as such, because there's a limitation with respect to the West, how much they can influence global trade on oil. But what the West has some sort of a monopoly on is insurance of oil tankers, insurance. And that was pretty kind of sophisticatedly used so that Western insurers are not able to insure trade of Russian crude oil if that crude oil is traded higher than $60 a barrel. And that seems to have actually been very efficient in terms of an instrument, and one of the kind of the building blocks is that no other buyer wants to pay more than the West pays for its crude oil. It doesn't make sense in a market environment to pay more. So that has sort of permanently lowered the price for that Russia receives from its crude oil. And my question does not relate to this, but since London Metals Exchange is pretty sort of important in terms of trading minerals, could we think of something in the similar lines of this happening, where basically the Russian minerals traded on the exchange are not perhaps banned as such, but are imposed with some sort of a similar type of mechanism, so that they're any thoughts?
I mean, Dan alluded to this earlier, and that's the question of innovation. Repeatedly in human history, war has led to inventions, really good inventions. And there's an irony to this, that in the act of humans killing other humans, they make medical discoveries. They make incredible scientific advancements. They figure out supply chain issues because they have to. You have to get the critical supplies the troops need to the front lines by the most efficient and effective way possible. And so it's tough to think about silver linings in this context. But much like we found new ways, better ways of doing things during the pandemic, all of the, and I'll say it, all of the evil that is occurring during this war, a war of conquest, an imperial adventure into sovereign territory, is going to lead to a scenario where the West finds ways of diverting its need away from those metals that it is importing from Russia. In a small way, this is already occurring, and maybe in not so small ways. One of the minerals that Canada does import from Russia is platinum, used in jewelry and, of all things, catalytic converters. Well, guess what need is slowly and in an accelerating way diminishing the need for catalytic converters, because we are converting to an EV, an electric vehicle outcome. We are innovating. We are getting there. And I think that war accelerates that pressure and that opportunity. And so this is, there was a great article that Nora sent around as we prepared for this panel. And it talked about the power of capitalism. The people don't want to pay an elevated price, and so they will find ways of innovating and getting around that price. So there is the moral imperative, and Dan has laid out the case really, really well, not only today, but in other appearances, including on TV. Never underestimate the impact of showing up to an event in a military uniform. People tend to listen to you a little bit more.
I checked my weapon in the door.
It's a Fasken requirement. No firearms in the bear pit. We're getting there, and I think to echo something Dan has said, maybe we just need to get there more quickly. And you can do it on a moral basis, or you can do it out of a rational sense of self-interest, but you do have to do it.
Yeah, we've all been very collegial till now, and I'm going to make a counterpoint, and I believe that politicians don't do complex. Energy sanctions were simple enough and a political win that could be executed effectively thanks to this pretty ingenious method of squeezing insurance or not underwriting shipments above $60. I think that's a lot tougher to do with these minerals. And again, I go back to the point I made at the beginning. There's a finite, very small number of countries that produce some of these minerals, like palladium, and there's an exorbitant number of companies and countries that depend upon them. So the economic imperative is not there. It's not an easy political win. It's not easy to execute on. And frankly, the media, I hate to disparage our media, but media doesn't do complex things very well either. And it's a bit of an explanation to people to understand that when they buy their cell phone, they are supporting Russia because the palladium that went into the motherboard that went into their phone, it's just not front and center for people's consciousness. And the media would have to invest an incredible effort to raise awareness, because it's only with public awareness that we get political pressure. Or political pressure either comes from public awareness or from economic pressure. And like I said, it is in no manufacturer's interest to bring this to the politicians' light and lobby for these sanctions. And there's no easy substitute. There would be a movement in price. Hydrocarbons, gas prices today are cheaper than they were before the war because we have lots of slack in the world supply of hydrocarbons to fill it, and it's been remarkable to switch. But I don't see that with metals, and I don't see the raising of consciousness of people. And unfortunately, there's not the same economic imperative to do it. And so I'm very skeptical about our ability, if we sit down a year from now, that there will be effective sanctions against these metals in Russia.
And I guess the question is, you articulated well why hydrocarbons are different, why we can sort of flip a switch, impose sanctions, and, sort of say that we've done what we can. I mean, what do you think that it is about minerals that is different? Is it a more complicated supply chain story? Is it just the widespread, integration of, a variety of different minerals into our daily needs? I mean, why is that such a hard distinction?
Yeah, I mean it's like asking people they wouldn't what's glass made of. They wouldn't know that it comes from sand. I mean, just people don't visualize that long a supply chain. And again, I go back to there's a finite number of suppliers. If you take away 20% of the world's supply, there's not slack supply that can. So it's going to raise the price. It's going to benefit 5 countries who produce that same mineral. Meanwhile, 150 countries are going to suffer because they have manufacturers that depend upon that. So it's also the balance of buyer and seller. The balance of buyer and seller in the hydrocarbon market is very different. There's a lot more sellers, and it's a much more equal parity between buyer and seller. So you're benefiting certain countries and you're hurting others, whereas with these rare metals, you're benefiting a very small number of countries, but you're hurting a much more of them. So
I think there might be another component to it also, that the impacts may be pretty kind of actor-specific. So there might be, say, a long-term supply contract with a Russian supplier of a Western sort of refinery, for instance, and there's a kind of a contractual obligation, and there might be also a significant economic impact regarding that sort of sourcing of that influences a particular Western operator, and that might also play in here. It's evident that somebody have kind of whispered into the ears of the EU sort of politicians what to sanction and what not. So
if I was leading a global electronics brand, an Apple or a Samsung or someone, and I found a way to wean myself off of Russian metals, I would make a lot of noise about that as a sort of competitive advantage, and that's perhaps where this might gather some momentum, is the assemblers themselves, the producers of these products, saying, you know what, we spent the last year weaning ourselves off of Russian supply of key minerals for our products, and we just want the world to know that we are no longer contributing in any way to Russia's ability to inflict damage on the Ukraine, and that would be a great marketing sort of position to take. But I don't see the pressure coming from governments.
And another kind of perspective on the Russian minerals that have not been sort of covered at all, it's kind of somehow being accepted, is the legacy of those mines. So I mean, we are sort of in the West, we are quite sort of sensitive as to the legacy of various operations. But there haven't been sort of discussion that a quite significant amount of the Russian mines are actually built by political prisoners during the sort of the 30s to 50s in Russia. So there's a quite messy sort of past of those operations that have caused tremendous amounts of lives, and that those are also basically upheld by this.
Maybe now it's time to sort of pivot to the third leg that Casper mentioned, which was, one, I think the China question, and what is China's role in all of this, and how does that impact kind of the minerals market, and then also geopolitically. But I guess first I want to sort of hear about the national security perspective on this, from the Canadian perspective. What does, in broad strokes, the future look like, and what is government's role in shaping that and that policy?
So I dearly wish I could predict the future in this regard.
Sitting here.
We wouldn't be sitting here. I guess, where would we be sitting? I guess I would know. What has plagued me in recent days is a single headline that I saw in, I guess, Wall Street Journal. It dealt with the role of China in this conflict. The fact that China has apparently, allegedly, made the decision to supply drones and lethal aid to Russia. As things stand prior to that headline, or as they stood prior to that headline, Ukraine had done, admirable doesn't cover it, a shockingly almost miraculous job of defending itself, defending Western democracy, holding Russia back, driving Russia out, to a point where, for the first time in my life, I'm a child of the 1980s, the great global combatants are the United States and Russia. You know, these are the two armies that, if they ever collided, would represent the end of the world. And suddenly, Ukraine is besting the Russians on the battlefield. Never in my life would I have imagined that could have happened. If that status quo could remain, we see a pathway where Ukraine could win with the help of its friends and allies, including Canada, unless China gets involved. And so from a national security perspective, which is a big concept for Canada, how does this end? And what role does Canada play in this? For me, and this will be a statement leading to a question for my fellow panelists, you have a scenario where Mr. Putin and his cronies and allies will never again in their lifetimes be able to leave territory that they have not conquered and held. They can't come to Canada. They can't go to the US. They can't go anywhere. They are permanently inadmissible to this country and hundreds of other countries around the world because of the things that they have, as an act of will, chosen to do to the Ukrainian people. That's incredibly dangerous because they have nothing left to lose. They have to win or they may literally die. I think of the role that people like General Rommel played in the Second World War, the Desert Fox, hero of the German army, an armored general who then turned on Hitler and began to devise ways to kill him and was discovered in that plot. 8 different times someone tried to kill Hitler and failed each time. There have to be people who are starting to think about this in Russia. But Dan, you've made some fascinating comments to us about the fact that still won't solve the problem. So for Canada, to summarize, we need to continue to find a way to be on the economic offensive against Russia, but also we need to get our strategic and military house in order, and that may take years. Although, during the Second World War, we found a way to do it much more quickly, and that's where Canada has failed and needs to stop failing. We need to get our house in order so that we can provide not 4 tanks, but 40 or 400 or whatever it is going to take.
Wow, there's a lot there to unpack. I think the question I get asked most when I do my presentations is, what does victory look like? What does it mean? Because what I hear over and over and over again from Western leaders is, we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. I don't know what that means. What we need to hear, especially from the Biden administration, is what that means is whatever the Ukrainians say it means, which they say. Victory is what the Ukrainians say they say, and we stand by that. Okay, well, what the Ukrainians say, President Zelensky's made very clear, our 1991 borders, the Russian army defeated and leaving Ukraine totally, War Crimes Tribunal, and Reparations Commission. Those 4 things. The first 2 are conditions for the others. So if that's what victory means, then let's start talking about that. Let's start articulating that as Western leaders, saying, we want Ukraine to win. Not just, we don't want Ukraine to lose. These are 2 different concepts. So we need Ukraine to win, and the Finns have been outstanding. I was just telling you, I have a shrine to Sarah Marin in my house. I mean, she and the Estonian Prime Minister, both women, are the toughest EU leaders. And they've been very clear that not only must Russia lose, it must lose very badly, it must be completely defeated, and it must understand that it loses. Because otherwise, there is no peace. All this stuff about negotiating, you should negotiate. My latte's gone up 30%. I'm not very comfortable with this. You should negotiate. It's always easy to give up somebody else's territory. And the problem is that that's not peace. That's a pause. All that does is give Putin a chance to rearm, to bring in more troops into whatever land he holds in Ukraine, including Crimea, to threaten the neighborhood. And it's a wide neighborhood, includes the Black Sea countries. and then he's going to come back. And he's going to take all of Ukraine, if he can, and he's going to continue. He's been very clear on that, especially with the Baltic states and Poland. And that's when Canadian soldiers die, because those are NATO countries. So victory, based on the definition of Ukrainians, which everybody has said they accept, must mean that now the resources have to be given and marshaled in order to achieve that victory. And the sooner the better. We've lost 35% of our GDP over the past year. We are really struggling economically. There's a lot of hardship. Notwithstanding the fact that Ukrainians can't rub two kopecks together, they have raised $500 million in donations to assist their army. And this will continue. And we'll fight and we'll raise and we'll do everything else, even if we don't get any more weapons. But this is not an outcome that the West should want. The total victory means that we get all the things that we've been promised now, and we get them in sufficient quantities. And that means that we don't obsess about what's going to happen in Russia. Spoiler alert, there's nothing you can do that is going to affect the outcome of what happens inside Russia. It's a dynamic we cannot control. It's a dynamic we do not understand. Those of you who've seen the movie Death of Stalin, it's a great movie, very funny, but it's also incredibly, it's like a manual. And so if we don't obsess about that and we say, look, we defeat them, this is a good, this is a public good, this is a national security good for us, for NATO, for democracy. Whatever happens after that in Russia, we'll deal with. This is not about Putin's war. I hear this from Canadians. Canadians, we like everybody. All people are good. It's the leaders are bad. And, if you just sat around the campfire saying kumbaya, we'd all get along. It doesn't work that way. That's not the real world. This is a war. And let me tell you, I don't know how many of you read Russian. If you do, I highly recommend, if you can stomach it, to read the Russian Telegram channels, where there are chats about how you must kill every Ukrainian woman so she can't have babies. And by the way, all the babies, they die too. And we'll double down on this. This is not about removing Putin, because that assumes that if you're going to remove Putin, you solve the problem. You do not solve the problem. What's going to come is probably going to be worse. But it creates a dynamic of change inside the country. And we should not be afraid of the decolonization of Russia. We have to stop treating Russia as a nation state. It's not. It's an artificial construct that is an empire. And it's a colonial empire. It colonizes, its only purpose is to colonize other countries, and sowing death, despair, and destruction. And so I think that these are the kinds of policy, these needs to be translated into policy considerations to get the war done this year.
So Daniel, if you say that basically we can't totally influence how things will develop in Russia, what type of structures can we do after kind of peace is achieved to kind of create a permanent situation where Russia will not continue aggressive sort of invasion of Ukraine after a pause?
You focus on Ukraine, not on Russia. You focus on integrating Ukraine into the European Union, become a member as soon as possible, making Ukraine a member of NATO. I mean, Ukraine is already de facto member of NATO. We are NATO's Eastern Shield. We're the only country in NATO that knows how to use all the weapon systems that NATO has. And in fact, we've made them interoperable, something the Americans have never been able to do, spending billions of dollars. And we do it with shoestrings. But it works. And so this innovation in the time of war, we're teaching NATO in real time how to use the weapons that were developed to defeat this particular enemy, not some abstract enemy that might attack us. As a Finn, you understand exactly what I'm saying. And these guys have been on your border. And so you integrate Ukraine. Had Ukraine, people say, well, Ukraine can never become a NATO because there might be a war. Hello. If Ukraine had become a member of NATO when George W. Bush tried to get NATO to take the decision in 2008, do you really think there would be a war today? Not a chance. Right answer. So, I mean, and we, aside from the fact we've earned our place, there are all sorts of good reasons why Ukraine becomes a member of the EU, a member of NATO, as part of the democratic world's strengthening of its economic and security and defense infrastructure. Russia will have to adapt to that.
So, taking an even further step back and looking at this from an even more macro view, I mean, what do you think the Russian sphere of influence looks like as this conflict progresses, as the relationship with China potentially strengthens? China has its own sphere of influence, which is strong in Central, Southern America, South America, strong in Africa. I'm curious about what that coalition starts to look like as this conflict deepens or, God forbid, continues for some time.
Well, as Daniel put it, Russia's empirical aspirations, they only work if they have something, if they can either threaten or they have something to offer those other countries. And, Russia was, because of the sale of hydrocarbons, because Western Europe was so reliant upon them for natural gas, because of its mineral industry, was beginning to gain influence around the world in small jurisdictions that were largely ignored by Western investors, where they could step in. So they were becoming influential. They've always had some influence in Cuba. They were influential in Venezuela. They were to some degree influential in Nicaragua. They are actually, there's Russian interest in mining right now in Guatemala directly as a result of this war. But Russia's, because of the sanctions and because of their the isolation, their inability to cost effectively move LNG around the world, it would cost $100 billion for Russia to build a pipeline to China to move their gas there, and nobody's willing to pay for it. They cannot put their gas into LNG and bring it to any of their natural markets other than Western Europe in a competitive way. The only reason they're pumping oil is because if they stop, the infrastructure that brings it out of the ground and pumps it will freeze and break. So they're pumping it, and they're making almost no money out of that oil. I can't remember the oligarch's name. Daniel probably remember, but a week ago came out and said, a year from now, Russia will be broke. And so this is a country that is shrinking by forget about emigration of Russians. It's shrinking by 1 million people a year. 2 million people die every year in Russia, and only 1 million are born. So it's a great shrinking country. It's rapidly aging. Many of its most talented people under 40 years old have fled already. I spend 4 months a year in Berlin, and it is filled with Russian speakers. Some of them are from Eastern Ukraine. A lot of them are sort of these digital nomads from Moscow and other big cities in Russia. So these are the brightest young minds of Russia that have left. This is a country whose economy, if you take away hydrocarbons and minerals, has very little to give the world. And so I do not see them as a long-term threat. I see them as a short-term threat. And this is where a lot of the thinking, I mean, I agree with what Daniel said, but a lot of the thinking, geopolitical thinking, has been, okay, Russia's not a threat in the long term, but in the short term, who's in command of those nuclear weapons and how rational a person that is important to us. I think that Russia will continue to shrink and will decolonialize because the neighboring countries, whether it's Kazakhstan and others, will realize that they have less to gain by being part of that Russian economy than they have by finding alternative partners, most notably China. But that process is now that thinking is now being enforced upon these people. The choices are a lot coming into light much faster, and they're much bigger choices today. And that's why the role of China is so pivotal, because if you're a Kazakhstani or if you're Uzbekistan or any of these other countries that have resources and you relied on Russian technology and Russian companies to exploit that and enrich you, And none of these are democracies. So we're talking about enriching, if anybody's read the Dictator's Handbook, he's talking about enriching the top 50 to 100 people in these countries. The Chinese are going to be the ones who replace Russia in keeping those autocracies afloat. And so China's role is not just about supplying Russia with weapons and capital, which I think they're more hesitant to do than they were 8 months ago. But it's also what China's role will be in terms of supporting these satellite countries and this decolonization process. They'll just become economic colonies of China instead of Russia, but it will help diminish the Russian threat.
Do we have any questions on the web or in the audience?
We do have one question that's come in on the chat. The question is, what is the role of global mining companies, kind of from an environmental standpoint, in talk? The questions, I think I'm paraphrasing correctly. Considerations of environmental reclamation in lands that have been destroyed, and whether the mining industry can play a role.
Go ahead, Andrew. I wasn't in Miami, so now I have to answer all the questions that no one can address. As good corporate citizens, of course they can play a role. I think that the first order of business is to attract investment to Ukraine when all of this, Lord willing, comes to an end. How it ends, I still don't think we've answered that question. And just to finish a thought that I don't think I properly finished, China is the game changer here. If China enters this war in any way, countries like Canada will be hard pressed not to sanction. And if we're sanctioning China, we are severely disrupting what is a very tense but vibrant trading relationship. So that's the first order of business if China does take a step to begin supplying the Russians militarily. Of course, China will simply turn and argue that, well, you all are doing it on the other side. You claim that you're not in the war, and yet you're providing materiel, training, what is now very clearly lethal support. Why can't we do it on the Russian side? And I think that's a really tough problem that the West is going to have to weigh and measure, because we have otherwise been very strong on the sanctions side, and China will have to become part of that if they enter this war. That's very complex. In terms of doing good in the universe, if this comes to an end and rebuilding the country, Canada, for instance, has a great, I don't often, just by virtue of disposition and political history, sort of warmly compliment federal departments, but some of them do a great job of certain things. And we do have something called the Canadian Commercial Corporation. We have Export Development Canada. They are meant to facilitate investment by underwriting that investment between Canada and another country. In this case, we would hope it would be Ukraine, and it would be Canadian businesses using their know-how and capability to help rebuild Ukraine. And I think the government of Canada, the people of Canada, including a really, really vibrant, strong, and impressive Ukrainian Canadian community, which was already large and is now growing by leaps and bounds because of some immigration policies the government has brought in, which could even be further still improved. That linkage is now so strong, will be so strong into the future, that I think Canada will play a leading role in rebuilding Ukraine when the time comes. May it come soon.
I come to think of two things where global mining companies can kind of play a role in this situation. One is to look more at sort of Western democracies as a place where to invest into mineral development, and that seems to be finally also kind of, at least in the EU, kind of the thought on sort of improving the position of own supply and security of supply of strategic minerals, even though kind of sort of project timelines are long, but engaging in the discussion with the governments on how to kind of make the regulation such that projects don't take sort of a couple of decades to take into production. And I think the other one, which was also raised here in the discussion, is it a kind of a correct development that Western mining companies stay out of certain jurisdictions because of it, that it's just from an ESG point of view too complicated to kind of explain that to investors, or kind of investors just don't want to see you in DRC or somewhere else, which kind of opens a vacuum for others. Do you want to fill in?
Yeah, I mean, going back to my point where I don't think there's an economic imperative for governments to lead the way on this, but corporations could, and certainly Canadian mining companies that are alternative suppliers to these minerals that come from Russia, where Canada's always had a very, very small equity position in Russian mining, with the exception of Kinross. The Canadian companies could say, hey, you know, we're mining palladium in such and such jurisdiction, and you know, let's make a case. Talk to their customers. Say, let's make a case to the world that we are sourcing these minerals from war-free zones, from democratic countries, and try to make a case for that. I think that's untreaded territory for mining companies. They're quite far removed from the end consumer, and so they don't tend to think in those PR terms. So it would have to be done in conjunction with their customers that are further downstream. But I want to go back to this China question, because right now, as we're sitting here in Beijing, there's a series of meetings that I think are even more important than what happened in October with the re-election, reappointment, however you want to phrase it, of Xi Jinping. And that is, he is basically unveiling his new cabinet, and he has replaced many of his of his inner circle. The skeptics will say that you know, this guy who has consolidated power in a way that we haven't seen since Mao Zedong in China is only using this exercise as an additional consolidation of power. This is a guy who's is going to be surrounding himself by yes men, etc., and that is certainly dangerous. There is another point of view that says this is a very stubborn man who, when he was surrounded by people who tried to steer him away from his policies, he fought against. But by bringing in his most trusted cronies around him, he may actually listen to them more. And a year ago, when the war began in the Ukraine, there was, you know, widespread speculation that Taiwan would be attacked anytime soon by China, and that the U.S., I live in the United States, would be in two wars, or you know, behind the scenes in two different wars. I think that there is a change of mood. First of all, China was focused entirely on net zero, and Xi Jinping's sole mission was to get reappointed in October. He achieved that. Within weeks, he drops net zero because he realized he's got 5 years to make his mark on China, and he can't do it if the whole country's under quarantine. So he let about 1.2 million people die over the last 90 days so that he could move forward with his open Chinese economy. I believe that China is going to do it in a way that they don't lose face, but is going to get back closer to the West than they've been during COVID. And I think that they miscalculated at the beginning. They tried to play both sides with Russia. There are definitely Chinese mercantilist interests that want to buy Russian assets at 10 cents on the dollar, and they can still do that. The difference is now they're going to wait until Russia's economy is further shrunk. And whereas they thought that by supporting Russia, that would be the way to win preferential treatment as Russia's future business partner, I think they now realize that that came at too big a cost to their European customers and their American bilateral, and there's still plenty of tension there. But I do believe that China will ultimately decide to not exactly fully support the West, but support it enough that they do not break those economic ties that they are still very, very reliant upon. China, without its ability to export to Europe and without its ability to export to the United States, is a much diminished economy and cannot do the things that they want to do domestically or even elsewhere. But, and they will try to become a more neutral and less pro-Russian actor, and then they will swoop in and buy the assets on the cheap whenever that time comes. That's my prediction.
To address the question first, we actually have a mining problem in Ukraine that mining companies can help solve, and that is taking out mines. We need to demine before we start mining, and 30% of Ukrainian territory is mined. That's the equivalent of demining the entire United Kingdom. This is decades of work in the making. I mean, some of the bravest people in Ukraine are our farmers, who in the occupied territories or deoccupied territories get on their tractors and try to plant the wheat that they know they have to do. And many of them lose their lives, their limbs, and everything they have. So I think that if there is get on the side of the angels, if you like, on the part of mining companies, this would be a great project to get in behind. You know, you can do lots of PR with the play on words and things like that. You know, we've been getting along far too well. So finally, I have something I'm gonna challenge. We got into it much earlier in Miami. I think that there are a number of issues that come out of the whole China discussion. Russia has essentially become a vassal state of China. First, John McCain famously said that Russia was basically a gas station for China run by gangsters. I would now say they're run by terrorists. But the fact that Russia has made itself so dependent on China has never taken place in the history of Chinese-Russian relationships. And historically, Russia has done everything possible to try to be the senior partner of that relationship. It's done. What's China's reaction going to be? I mean, I'm not a China expert, but my observation of dictators is that as they surround themselves with cronies and people who tell them what they want to hear and like-minded individuals, it creates a vicious cycle rather than a virtuous cycle. And I think that security in the Communist Party of China's manual will always trump economics. And to them, like with the Russians, the enemy is America. And the Russians need the Americans as an enemy so that they can maintain power. The elites can maintain power inside the country and control their people by sowing fear. The Chinese see this as a much different, they see themselves as a competitor in the sense that we need to for global influence, but especially vis-a-vis Taiwan. So I think that we are in for a much less benign scenario as this world, as you correctly pointed out earlier, becomes bipolar. We have the democracies of the world centered around an America that is less Pax Americana than a convening power of coalition of willing democracies, and the axis of evil, which is now headed by China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Brazil, Indonesia, and India have to decide which side their bread's buttered on. You can't straddle both of these forever. But this brings up the last point that I really did want to make earlier, and that's the issue of values. That I think that we've sort of been talking around this issue in terms of moral issues and things like that. But I think more than anything else, for me, both as a Canadian and as a Ukrainian, somebody living in Ukraine for 30 years, has been the fact that Ukrainians have shown Western democracies that values matter, that freedom matters. The freedom is not free. I often feel in this country that people have a sense of entitlement, that somehow we're entitled to the freedoms we enjoy with Canadians. They are a God-given right. The government guarantees them. The Constitution guarantees them. Courts guarantee them, and we all carry on. Freedom's not free. It comes at sometimes a terrible price, and unless you are prepared to defend it, somebody will always try to take it away. And we've shown that it's better to die on your feet a free person than to live on your knees as a slave. When you compare the citizens of Ukraine with the slaves of Russia, it's very stark. And this is the kind of government you get then. It's not hard to do, hard to figure out. So I think that very fundamentally, when it comes down to victory, I think that if we get the things that I've been talking about, we see the collapse of the Russian army this year. There's historical precedent. I'm just going based on historical precedent. 1905 and 1917. In 1917, there were 4 million men under arms in Russia. There was internal turbulence in St. Petersburg. The soldiers had had enough. They shot their officers, threw down their guns, and went home. We've been fighting the Russians and the Soviet Union for 70 years in the West at trillions of dollars of cost, at a cost of 0.01% of the GDP of Ukraine, of NATO countries. You can have this result by the end of the year. Arm Ukraine now.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, but I know that there were some questions we didn't get to, so please come up.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. That was a great session. I could listen to this for hours. I'm sure some of you could as well. I really would like it to go on as long as it can, but we are limited by time. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I just want to give the panel a round of applause. I think everybody. Just a couple notes I want to make. This afternoon's session that was supposed to be at 4 o'clock, the greening of global food security from mine to fork has been canceled. There has been a notice that's gone out to say that it's due to travel problems. You know, some of you may have trouble getting into Toronto after what we had on Friday. So unfortunately that has happened. Our next panel is going to be tomorrow morning. It's the Latin American panel. It's our annual, and we've done it for I don't know how many years in a row. Now Paul Farnazari has organized that. I think John is going to be on that one again. We like John. He's going to come back. And Andrew's actually going to be back tomorrow afternoon on critical minerals. That's another session that we have. So you can sign up for any of the ones that we have left. We have 3 more sessions. Those are all tomorrow. That's at fasken.com. And when we hope to see you at the next session. Thank you, everyone, for coming out today.